Hello and welcome to another episode of Drawn Long Sessions on Global Architecture based on a village of 100 people. Today we're doing a second Buddhist site called Kinkaku-ji in Japan. The official name is Rokonji Deer Garden Temple, but it's referred to as the Temple of the Golden Pavilion because once you check it out online in color, you'll see that it's clad in gold. It's a Zen Buddhist temple in Kyoto, Japan, which fortunately post-World War II, most of its great architectural pieces were spared some of the devastation of World War II. One of the most popular sites in Kyoto, it's designated as one of the 17 locations making up ancient Kyoto itself as a World Heritage Site. So what we're going to work with here in terms of the language of the architecture is fairly simple because as you can see by the photograph over here, it really is three boxes sort of stacked and have cantilevered roof lines to that. So the original design for the Japanese statesman Kuntunse was from 1397, and then he sold it to a shogun, Yoshimitsu. And when he passed, he then dedicated it and converted it to a Zen temple as per his wish, and the Zen Buddhists have lived there ever since. And has been rebuilt a couple of times due to fires. It's being a wood frame building, but today's extent is protected by contemporary means to ward off trouble like that. So we're going to simply start with the realm of finding our typical solution to perspective here by finding where key vanishing points lie on the horizon line. And so our view shed is going to be basically from this corner, as you kind of look at the photograph over there. So you see the three boxes stacked and projected eaves to sort of cloister the skins of it. And what's remarkable about this site is the building, obviously, but also the presence for the first time where the landscape is equally important. So we're going to spend a little bit of time adorning the ponds and the landscape and the topiary around the building too, because they're given sort of an equal status in the Zen Buddhist faith of the natural presence. So one of the first things you want to establish in the perspective, as you see here, is that we are at the same height across a pond onto a little island that's going to be almost at the height of the rail in terms of our view shed. That first top railing line is almost a horizontal line, probably a tick above that. So we can find that down here by taking any of the tick marks that run in a parallel fashion to the left and then run them out, and they will meet at a certain point, which will then backtrack and guide us to that point of that railing coming back horizontally. So we can run that about, that's the corner of the rail, and that'll run back across the whole paper to the right side and off to the right vanishing point. So we're close enough here and we're equal distant away from the 2 points, this corner, that both left and right will be off the page. So again, make sure that any horizontal we draw, they're all parallel in real space, but they're converging to 1 point in the perspective. So the gold leaf covers the top and the second floors in terms of all the skins, and it's a little bit more plebeian on the first floors, being more of a service area for that. The gold had more meaning rather than beautifying the pavilion. It was intended to mitigate and purify negative thoughts and feeling towards death. So a lot of times in ecclesiastical architecture, it's not just the beauty of the material, it's its intent about its imaginative purpose for the faithful. And a lot of viewers to this day, when you visit Kyoto and come to this site, you'll only be allowed, because it's an active temple, to view it from across the pond. So the tourists kind of meander around and get multiple views of this and see its relationship in there. It was built in one of the wealthy aristocratic circles in Kyoto. It's in the shinden style, and the pillars were from natural wood while the walls are of white plaster, on the lower level being, again, more sort of proletariat or common to support the two golden parts of it as it rises up on the watershed there. Sometimes when the right is light, the light itself seems like it's almost inflamed because the gold reflects as the sun sets, and it's a real spectacle on the site. So let's begin by doing our finding of boxes like we always do. And we'll find that there is, at the tops of the columns that set up the second floor, they're all vanishing at left point. So there's the left side of the first box. And then its railing detail that goes up and about. And the underside of the first floor box. And then the bottom of the rail, since we have the top as our horizon line, the bottom of the rail will actually pitch back and go up to the left vanishing point. And as it makes its way down to the water line, we'll have the rail come down and poke into the stone base for it. And we'll see sort of a crenellated view later on of the stone. And then that will simply mirror, once again, like I've done before, in perspectives that are in a waterway. And then those will vanish up as well. So we'll find these key points and then the first floor being reflected in the water below. So that'll be one of our value studies we do at the end to make sure we know that this amoebic shape over here is the waterway showing part of the pond coming up to the building proper. And moving up to the top side here, we've got the first major roof pitch, which comes out and then curves out to this intended detail on both ends there. And we sort of bracketing up and making it sort of being pulled up to the heavens. And then coming on the other side and returning to the right vanishing point. And then to finish off the left side, here's the top, again, doing that on this side. And then beneath it is its box. And this box on the third floor, which is the more religious sanctuary of the space, is pushed in from the lower two levels. So that will run back to that left vanishing point and then come to its corner to meet it here and then return to the right. Now all the right points are coming back down to that vanishing line as they make the way across. So we can make those broad sweeps now, and then we'll take away what we don't need line-wise with value in a little bit. And then to return the corner, this is being chased back in the opposite direction, and this hat is coming back from this side as this comes down and touches that horizontal and flares back up. This one's coming back from left vanishing point. So in fact, compared to some of the other forms we've worked with recently, this one's much more tectonically simple in its architecture, but it's got this new twist and design in almost international language of how architecture relates to its inherent gardens next to it, where instead of being controlled by mankind and being rectangular and rigid, it almost seems like it's dropped down into a natural haven of the best of nature. It's fully designed. Every move out here is designed to have that spectacle. So even some of the pods of islands within here are actually the shape of the islands that make up Japan. So it's got a lot of symbolism as you walk around here, as it explains some of the premises of what the temple's all about. So at the very top, the roof has a pyramidal pitch to it, but it comes down on its pyramid and then quickly bows out to these sort of ship-like prows that go out in the four corners. And we'll see the front two do that right in front of us here as they bow up. And then we see a little swale in this one, but then it evens out to be flat again before you see the secondary swale. And then sort of projection of a lower roof is seen underneath it and then returns back to the right. And here's the rail detail of that third floor. And that stops right about here. And then the second floor itself is a bit squatter than the rest of the stages of the building. So we see a bit of the underside on both cases, and then struts of structure that project out and create the projection of the roof, the cantilever of the roof back to that one point. That return goes over to its railing detail and has a certain height to it, vanishing to the right point. And then we see the roof line beneath it from this side coming over all the way over to its projection, which is a bigger space beneath it. So that roof line extends out further into the landscape and then tips up and comes back to the left vanishing point on this side. So now we're sitting with our basic hats here to its finial piece up top. Now, on the underside, there are a series of columns that support the language of the plan inside. It isn't purely symmetrical. It's got some loaded aspects to the plan where the column grid shifts for its interior usage. As you can see on the second floor, when this comes down to its floor plate here, we see the railing come and return to the right. But the second floor actually is smaller in square footage of interior space than the first floor, and yet there are panels that open and close to create more indoor-outdoor spaces. So it can become enclosed or opened up. And our drawing will let us see us through to the back garden here, as it allows these walls to kind of disappear and float. And that's the lovely quality of Japanese architecture. It's its ability to sort of contemporize traditions with a very simple architectural movement of planes in space. Now, before we get to any detail on the pace that fronts the part of the building that fronts us, we're going to consider this projecting perpendicular to the main waterway here as our principal elevation, and we're going to let the nature then have sort of a primary view here. Normally, we have the nature be setting up the building, but because the building is sort of equal partners with the landscape here, we're going to let this come in and do a particular type of tree indicated by the photograph here and give it some presence as subject matter and not just support cast. So we're going to come out with a very large trunk that's been bending over the years and moving its way down to the water. As it rises up, each tributary of the branches gets smaller until it kind of crescendos in its conifer fashion here, and then gives it a lovely, natural, kind of contradictory amorphic shape rather than sort of hard architecture adjacent to it. And for now, we'll just kind of do the outline of the series of branches that give mass in terms of tone adjacent to our gold structure. And this is part of the distance of it. And that way it becomes a subject in front of our subject. So we've got sort of a foreground, but also a subject matter foreground. We'll give it more detail than we normally do. And now we'll take it over to the right here. It kind of has a twin system on this side. And it rises up, and a bit of it eclipses the roof line on this side. So we're not being wholly accurate to it, but we're being a little bit more than just symbolic with a cartoon version. We're trying to be truer to the individual tree that's on this site. We'll take care of the rest with just secondary ideas about the landscape. We'll come down to the base here and we'll show, as this kind of has an inlet of water between this and the island that this is on, it'll trail back. And so the frontispiece of the rock and boulders that were placed here are important to us. Then the tree projects out, and then it lays against the groundwork that this railing then sits on over here, because there's an extension platform that comes out at the base of the building. And that comes all the way down to the waterway. And that returns to larger boulders on this side, which are the bastion of structure to counterbalance the waterway adjacent to it. So on the right, we'll keep pushing with more of the vegetation which are adjacent to it. And then that's where we use it just as a symbol of framing the sketch. Because we want to do is have the eye come up to this foreground tree and celebrate its singular quality, then to our true subject in the middle ground, and then sort of as the pond goes back and around here, it'll dissipate to the walkways, kind of at eye level here. We'll put some people there in a little bit. Then the undercarriage is some of the foliage that's adjacent to those walkways, and the tiers that kind of build up to the short hills in the backdrop. And we're only catching one glimpse of a very large complex that is two distinct bodies of water with several islands inside of them, and they're all designed intentionally for a purpose to tell a story. Now, on the backdrop over here on the right side, we'll use some of the vegetation to come up. We want to hold this as very important, puncturing the backdrop of darker tones, and this is going to puncture it as well. So we'll take care of the valley in a little bit, but in the meantime, we're going to take the heights of this hill on this side and have it run behind it and continue kind of on a diagonal, getting taller and kind of peaking at this point. So it gives scale to the whole sort of park setting for it. And that'll be from grade all the way up. So we simply want to have a closer version, more of a foreground version of the vegetation over here on the right, and then the real foreground here to be in front of that. So you've got this zone, the house zone, that background, which ties into this background. So we're going to use value to move ourselves in and around the whole structure here. Finally, at the top, just because we'll take off from the photograph here, we'll bracket the top by having this other type of tree that's got some very exotic type of brushwork on it that will bring lineal elements down and then shine out into star-like structures of leafing and green work. And that has to be a reference to give a frame for the sky, because we'll leave the rest of the sky sort of just a tone of a gray to represent the blueness that's not being able to shown in our black and white work here. So that'll just be a placeholder for now. We'll come and detail those in a little bit, but that gives us sort of a way to, again, frame it on three sides and then kind of pour off to the openness on that side. So again, to create some eye movement along the way. As I mentioned, the pond contains, the whole pond itself reflects the building, but it contains the site, 10 smaller islands, where the Zen typology is seen through the rock composition. Bridges and plants around the pond are arranged in a specific way to represent famous places in Chinese and Japanese literature. So that's where everything here seems sort of romantically like maybe it was just found architecture, but in fact, it's all highly designed. The present pavilion is from 1955 because it was rebuilt again because of some issues with fire along the way. The pavilion incorporates the three distinct styles of architecture for each floor. So there is the shinden, which is sort of the service area, then the samurai, and the Zen up above. And those change how the interiors are used and who accesses them and their materials and things. And they're all kind of unified then by the gold quality of the top two floors, and hence it's named the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. So let's do our light study here and assume this is going to be the broadest light over on this side, on the pond side of it, which means we can come back into all of our elements that are facing us and just wash those away with our initial gray. Now I'm in the underside of these as well. And then the underside of the roof pitch that cantilevers out. This one also is cantilevering out and doesn't receive direct light. So that's got to be grayed out. And then obviously there's going to be a throw of the sun. So if it's a little bit later in the day, it won't have quite a large shadow to it. Let's just assume a certain height, and that'll wash out that much of that elevation. And then there'll be a little bit more of a dark pitch to the top of here, because not only is it in shade, but it receives less ambient light as it bounces off and tries to move underside the roof. So that still is, it's not an actual cast shadow, but it reads like one. Then we do the same for the lower level, but the difference here is that we're going to open up these panels here so we see through this wall back into the other. So we'll see some columns in the distance there that open up that space, but we're only going to see the underside of the interior that gets valued and shaded out. And over on this side, coming down around, and we won't touch the tree just yet. And then again, the cast shadow by the projecting roof line, which will again have from its point a certain thickness that comes down a fascia. So where it isn't picked up at the light, it becomes darker. Then we have the shade side, the entire underbelly of that. And that'll wrap around both sides. And over to this point. And now at the lower level here, to again highlight the idea that the more sacred part are the top floor and the second floor here. They're the gold area. They're more celebrated in terms of purpose. That's the samurai and the Zen floors. The shinden down below is really more utilitarian. So it's a dark wood and it isn't adorned with the beautiful materials. So it's going to be a much darker tone just to start with. So as it receives less light, it'll go significantly darker than the rest of the structure. So once we line it out here, we can come from its projected end and get a little bit stronger right away with value there. Take that through the tree. Because once we establish our value, we're going to play off how much value we give the tree relative to what's behind it. Because this is a good 30 to 50 feet away across an inlet of water from the building. We have to pull that off and closer to us. So we'll do that with whites as well as darks. And that rotates over here until we don't see anymore. And then the columns come down. There's 1, 2 there. They're fairly bold against a lighter background. This one in the front, we're going to leave a white area to it because we're going to go darker behind it. So the first two are there, and the end of the interior comes down right on this line. And that's set back because we see a bit beneath the railing detail, that floor level. So here's the line of the rail. And now kind of at waist height, there's another line of development of that lower level, which is when you slide some of the panels open, you can see interior, but they're darker spaces. So these will go darker across the way. Another column shows, and then runs around that corner behind our tree again. So we'll see that lower level is a way that supports the more airy and specialized forms of structure and function up above. And then we come to some of the detail of the rail. It's got all the ones across have got 3 levels. They've got the top rail for the hand. And again, this one's going to come out and float because there's spaces that are used above here. And then there's a middle rail before you get to the base rail. So that covers here. This one's got its piece. It'll go further out to this edge. And then the middle rail. And this bottom one has got the top one holding on to the middle rail at its base. And then all the verticals line up. So we have this one coming down to here, coming down to there, and the strut. So we just make sure we've got that lined up here. And that gives it support as this deck actually cantilevers a bit beyond its actual base, which means on the underside of this lip of that floor, it's very dark because it's a cast shadow from the sun. And then the stones start beyond that. And that gives a little bit of a place of this now sitting on the water. So just to hint at that now, we can take the exact same language, which is above the horizon line, and twin it down here. So all the horizontals that were above. So this has its stone coming down and then being repeated in the water. So there's stone on stone. And the height of the railing is here. And beyond the railing, we'll see some of the green later on. But then we've got 1, 2, and 3 key columns. And they're going to have their height, that element where that stops, show up down here as well. So we're just sort of, again, flipping this image over and drawing an imprint of it. And we can determine the value of that later on in terms of depth of range of tone. But because the entire thing is in a small pond and it's fairly calm water, it's a really great mirrored image of it, very still. And yet we don't want it to be the same amount of value we put into this. So we're going to take all the tone of water and give it at least 10 or 20% without any real pure whites intentionally. So once we come up to the stones that are being reflected, they'll be a shade darker. And this certainly comes right up to where there's the corner piece. We'll eventually draw this arc going back, vanishing in perspective, which should be darker. Here's the inside. At that point, it's much darker as well. But that waterway keeps going right up here next to our secondary subject matter here in the foreground. So it turns and kind of goes around. It gets a sense to move the water around the base of the building. So to highlight that, wherever the water edge meets land, will come in and kind of signify that. It'll pop out here a bit for the building, meet the base of the stones here, and then wrap away to this side and over on that side beyond. So that is a placeholder now to identify a new condition that we haven't seen in some of the temples and ecclesiastical work so far, of the base and how it sits in nature is very, very important. So the amount of design seems to be less monumental, but much more detail oriented in terms of relationship of man and nature, or man as a part of nature. Okay, so now we'll come into some of the backdrop. So we get establish all of our values here. We're going to be able to see through this space to get to the background of green trees, and those in full foliage in the spring and summer months have got a pretty strong value to them, but they're farther away, so they wouldn't be as strong as if they were your subject matter. And they're going to be seen here on top of the deck all the way up to where that wall slides back to. So we want to be able to, which is always great if you can find that in architecture, a way to get somebody to go from the outside of the building onto an interstitial space, indoor-outdoor space, and then into the interior with this roof line here, and then back out again. So you've got a way to create 5 zones of space in this one little sort of 2-inch area. To make that seem more dominant, we'll keep making that a little bit darker right where it is relative to the cast shadow adjacent to it. And that'll happen a lot with modern stuff we get to in further sections of the Draw Along lectures. Okay, so we did some horizontal work on these. We can come back and do some of the struts that come along the way. It seems like most of the breakdown between things are going to give a horizontal feel to the final piece. So we'll just keep that pattern moving toward the corner and then step those down along the way here, and then step those down for our final piece of the railing down here. We turn the corner, then we'll see a couple sections before the tree covers them up. And we'll see them all up above. Again, it's really makes 2 stacked horizontal elements by spreading these far enough apart. And if we go there, and then we'll see a little bit on this side because this is the broadest projection of a deck. And so right where we come to the point of that meeting the deck, we'll see a little kickback of this line of rail come to that corner, and now that corner goes back to our left vanishing point. So you continue the outside of it, but as it wraps around and go down, we see the piece on our side here and the piece going back in perspective. Maybe a little bit, depends on how we detail the tree here, how much of that will cover up the rail detail. Okay, so the background comes up, meets that side. We'll variate these stepping down because it's a short hill that's very close on the property. So this has to appear farther away, and this gets closer to us. As the same hill gets closer to us, it's a stronger value. Even if you work in color, a green tree in the foreground might look like a blue-green tree or maybe a purple tree in the distance. Things go, they're less in detail and they get cooler in the distance. As nature approaches you, they get warmer and more intense with depth of value. So we'll build that up with time as it comes down and kind of kisses the walkway down below here. Well, that's a start just to kind of wash that up. And the more we do, it'll allow the whites that are being struck, the golds are being struck by the sun, to be more dominant. We're running through to the other side, and we've got a wash over here. And there'll be several zones we can add it to. Once you get to the last couple inches of the page, just kind of wash it out and don't worry about any kind of structure or detail there. It'll hold on. And then we see a bit more of the building beneath the movement of vegetation on this tree. And so we'll see when it comes to the actual white plaster, the sort of cheaper structure, we'll see some of the pattern of the woodworking adjacent to the plaster on this facade. So it's not on this side, it's all more woodwork, but on this side, it's got it on those two panels there, where we'll see the breakout or the movement of these systems of paneling your Japanese space. And then in the backdrop from there, we need a little bit of movement of this path coming through and around. And then to pull the building off of that, this vegetation will go darker in the background adjacent to that edge. So it's important for us to hold that corner of where the box actually ends. And then it'll be here and here. So it's starting to come together. Now we can go back in and work with our finishing lesson points that are about all the sketches in these sessions of now pulling out, since we've got everything established probably from 20% to 60%, where we're going to put 70, 80, and 90% and a little bit of true black. So first, let's go back and simply line out more of the key edges where we want to stop colors, because there really are no lines in architecture. This line doesn't exist. The tone of the sky and the value of the material form a line, which we can draw from, but we want to eliminate too much lines if we can in the short time for the sketch to make it less about linealism and more about light, shade, and shadow. So let's start left to right and come around to our edges here and show our understanding of this edge holding space beyond it, its key point, and then the secondary roofing beneath it that goes back beyond over here. Then the corner of our box, which meets that edge. And we've got little struts of structure we can kind of line out to secure the projection of the roof floating out that far. And then secondary lines that come in, they're a little bit decorative, but they're trying to harbor attention to what the actual brim of the architecture looks like. And the roof is tiling, which is a darker pattern. So we'll come back and give a little pattern in a little bit, but we'll simply go left to right with the tone. As adjacent to the brightness of the sun, it'll appear darker. And then when the sun opens up and gets more of the side kicking back up to it, it'll be a little bit lighter right at this edge, this tip. And then we'll take that same line work around to that edge. Strengthen the far, because that's about space. A little bit of detail on the finial. Back to the other side. And now we have to, again, close the box up top, because that's a strong element for us. There are two arched openings here, a little bit unusual for what more aspects of Japanese architecture is like, but they're found in this space. You can maybe highlight a little bit more of the edge of the railing right at that corner and right at this corner. And as it returns again, it's going to go back to the right vanishing point. So we box that box around, the front box behind it. And then there's an open panel system up here that's closed right now, a double door. And they all have the potential, just like the lower rooms, to kind of open up and create different types of purposes depending on the event or the service or the prayer or whatever is happening there. It's a sort of a flexible, almost pre-modern idea of architecture. And now we have to pull this plane off the building too, like we pulled that off the sky, but coming back here and hitting those edges. That'll help make that not lay flat on the paper and brush towards us a bit. And record it over here and take it back. Because we've got pretty close to the same density of value in the photograph between the underside here and the trees beyond it, we have to make a decision for the actual, that was taken from three-dimensional space. We have to do this on a piece of paper. So we're going to take the underside of this corner and make that darker than the background. And that'll pull it off of that background a bit. This one doesn't need so much attention because it's against the white of the sky. And then we'll come down to the edge here. We've got a singular column, but it looks bright next to the background. So rather than making it all dark, we're going to make those columns that are on the back have a little sense of light to them against a darker backdrop of the trees. And then down here, when it actually is a darker material, we'll make those dark against a lighter background. And at the tops of some of those interior spaces, we can make those a little bit darker to show some movement along that way. And because the whole thing is wood-sided and darkly stained, that part rotating over to here, we'll see a little bit above by the time we finish the tree, it's got a darker tone to it. And then it turns white on this end when you get to the stucco. So depends on how much foliage you put in. But now we decide on how we're going to shape this foreground tree. And because it really needs to pull now even closer to us, now this edge of that tree is going to have to get more dominant. So a much stronger black, certainly on the edge that lays against the building, will help pull that off. And the shape of these is really sort of a rounded form, but it's got sort of a brittle edge to it. So the overall shape is sort of sinuous, but it's got that kind of fine construction to the actual tree that makes it a little more dominant when, as a feature once you get closer to it. We'll take that all the way around to the ones here, and then the one that's closest to us on the base. We'll have a dark tone to it, and then into the structure will support it. And today, so far, we've got line work for it, but now we're going to come in with tone and say that that branch is have a cast shadow on that. So wherever you've got branches so far, there'll be now zones of nice black tone, which are going to help support this. Then light will come in and open up and light up part of it, and then again cast a shadow on another part. And then again, shadow cast here, make it light, shadow cast, and then you're holding up the vegetation again. Underside there. And so you sort of vary it along the way, because again, the tree isn't the subject, but it's so close it becomes sort of a semi-subject for you. And that'll start to pull it off. I think we need probably more on this lower level here to get it off the ground as well. And then we'll come in and say that it's lit up at the top more. So all these pods of pine-shaped branches would be darker anyway on their lower area as they're picked up by the tree shape. And I'm intentionally making sure you understand that this is important on some architectural perspectives to really adorn the nature, because that's the intent of why the nature is shaped and put there. That is a specific type of tree planted there, and it's nurtured just like the building is, as having the same type of consistency in the language of that and the faith. So that'll come down to the ground, and then sort of graphically we can have that either become a value there, or if you like kind of idea of becoming more line work and back to kind of two-dimensional to page, that's fine. And that's kind of designer's choice of what you want to do with that language. And now we'll come on the back side. We want to pick up the edge of that one, and then probably that edge is going to get darker as it goes against that dark in the background. We don't want to fight and have those both the same tone. This one probably is darker against the sky here and washes up whiter towards us. So every time you see a plane of value now, you're going to gradate that from one darker tone and just let it kind of bleed off to the same gray you did have. There's always a movement of your planes as you move across the space. When you come to the corner, there's a little break of structure and points that meet every corner of the structure coming out from the walls. And so as that comes down and meets there, it'll change some of the lighting right at that point. So it grays out a little bit tighter right at that juncture, and then becomes the normal tone you had already left on that side. So make sure you move those about. You've got the corner of our building nicely here. And now maybe these could just simply leave white because they've got the edge of the structure next to them. If you find anything you're doing doesn't make the sketch more interesting or more true to its life form, then don't draw it. Just make your decisions in the end here. Is it just time you're killing now, or is it something that's going to enhance the language of what you've drawn to date? So that's probably all the pieces we need in the puzzle. We could probably then say, okay, where does the final dark go here? I would say that you could come back certainly on the left side over here and come to all the edges. And against the whites, put the blacks finally. There's really no view into the interior, but it can assume that if one of these panels was open, there might be an extension of a view into there. If a door opened up there, that might help out. On the second floor, these panels are closed down now along its grid. Maybe the shadow a little bit darker on this edge before we make the turn into this shape. But over here, maybe it goes darker yet because the eye is going to be drawn to that dark. And then maybe the tops of the columns are a little bit darker before they're lightened up by the backdrop. Same is true down here. The corner is going to pitch out right where we are at this point. So this probably top third goes a little bit darker. But at this point, you're judging by yourself and where your drawing ends up and what needs to happen to keep clarifying it. Now, this part of the building, right, this middle section, and this is sort of our key third, obviously, because it's the third, a third, and a third. That part of the third is the part that has to be absolutely closest to us. You can't treat this edge with stronger domination than the one that's actually closer to us. So come to that corner and strengthen the movement of light away from that. The underside moving over here, the depth of that black there. The underside of this one, and just trail it off. Eventually, maybe the value of some of the vegetation towards this third. This part of the tree is less important than that part of the tree. This edge again, and you're simply just trying to drive home with your values now as you move yourself from 0 to 100%. You push more 70s, 80s, and 90s on the last most important inch or two of the drawing. Now, to give scale, obviously the scale's there. It's indicated by the railing detail. But if you want to put, one of the Zen Buddhist monks up here, their height would probably be in perspective a little bit back from the rail, and then their torso, and you'd see a little bit less of their legs that's cut away by the roof line. But that would be kind of the height, kind of a gray garb there, and hands on the railing as they kind of reflect on the natural and the built environment at the same time here. And up top, we'll probably go in and do a little bit more definition of the structure that brings these things down now before they do their sort of spectacular pattern adjacent. And it's not an absolute necessity here, but because they are in the photograph, we'll give some kind of relative idea to it. They kind of spring out in all directions, 360. And as you get away from your subject, it just trails off to a sort of nondescript graphic. Maybe at the top, you can clarify that a little bit. And now at the backdrop, probably at the base here, where most of the vegetation comes down and has the ground, it's got its underside of shadow that it casts on itself. So if you build that up as a stronger base, the darkest part of the adjacent forested or growth area is the lower third of that. So we can come back in here and show that as having a little bit more movement right at the base. And then potentially here, you can see some of the depth of the beams and the darkness of that part of the shape of the building. And then to help a little bit of the projection of that shadowing coming across here, just cut some, not even in perspective lines, only with themselves, those kind of movement lines that show water on the surface kind of moving. So in the distance, it's all very tight lines. And the exact same lines get further and further apart as they come towards us. And that'll kind of create a skin on top of the mirror itself, and the mirror comes over and helps reflect things for you. And then this idea of this vegetation over here would actually have its twin, and then finally the hill beyond it. So that hill will be a darker tone than the reflection of that, and that'll come and run behind the structure. And that may help set it down as well. So that's our next to last search into world religions. We go to a multi-ethnic to end the piece, where now we've hit all the major religions. We've got at least a 20% aspect of performance of global faiths. The next one is kind of a catch basin of Mesoamerica, one of the oldest pieces we'll look at. And I'll talk about how we don't even know the people and historically who were there. We just simply know how the Aztecs and Mayan have referred to them in their cultures. So that's the next step in our 10th and final draw along session on world architecture.